The medical report described a neck snapped like a twig, the kind of trauma usually found in high-speed car crashes. Yet the most chilling part of Perro Aguayo Jr.'s death wasn't the silence of his heart, but the roar of the crowd. In a twisted irony that defines the dark side of wrestling, thousands of fans stood up and cheered for a corpse, convinced they were watching a masterclass in acting, completely unaware that their hero, Rey Mysterio, had just accidentally killed a man in front of the entire world. Join us as we unravel the heartbreaking story of the night the show didn't go on, and the tragic legacy left behind by the Prince of Lucha Libre. Pedro Aguayo Ramirez was born on July 23, 1979 in Mexico City, not merely into a family, but into a dynasty of blood. From his very first breath, he was the crown prince of a brutal kingdom. He was the son of Perro Aguayo, the dog of Nochistlan, a man who had carved a legacy out of scar tissue and sheer unadulterated violence. For Pedro, there was no blank slate. His destiny was pre-written in the magazines, the arenas, and the expectations of a nation that worshipped his father as a working-class deity. He was born to bleed for their entertainment. For most children, the smell of comfort is baking bread or fresh laundry. For Pedro Aguayo Ramirez, the scent of comfort was a pungent cocktail of wintergreen rubbing alcohol, stale sweat, and old leather. This was the olfactory backdrop of his earliest memories. He did not grow up in a nursery. He grew up in the dressing rooms of the Toreo de Cuatro Caminos and the Arena Mexico. While other toddlers were learning to stack wooden blocks, Pedro was sitting on a wooden bench, his legs dangling far above the concrete floor, watching giants prepare for war. He watched as his father, a man who transformed from a loving dad into a snarling beast, taped his wrists with the precision of a surgeon. The locker room was a sacred, terrifying place for a child. It was a place of silence before the storm. Pedro learned early on to be invisible. He saw men, uncles essentially, groaning as they laced their boots, their bodies ravaged by decades of falls. He saw the rituals of pain management, the injections, the pills, the massages. He saw the scars up close, the raised keloid tissue on his father's forehead that looked like a road map of a violent life. To the public, Perro Aguayo Sr. was a monster. To Pedro, he was Papa. This cognitive dissonance defined Pedro's early psychology. He would sit in the front row, often in the arms of his mother or a handler, and watch thousands of people scream for his father's blood. He watched his father get hit with steel chairs. He watched him bleed buckets of red plasma that stained the canvas. At 5 years old, how do you process the sight of your father being beaten to a pulp? You don't. You absorb it. You normalize it. Pedro learned that violence was a job. It was a transaction. You give the blood, you get the cheers, or the booze, and then you buy groceries. This normalization of extreme violence was the first brick in the wall of his destiny. He didn't fear the blood. He respected it. He understood even before he could articulate it that the Aguayo name was a currency minted in pain. As Pedro entered school, the reality of his lineage began to cause friction. In Mexico, Lucha Libre is not a fringe subculture. It is mainstream pop culture. Everyone knew who Perro Aguayo was. For Pedro, this meant he was a target. The nepotism trap didn't start when he became a wrestler. It started in the elementary school playground. Other boys, fueled by the bravado of youth, wanted to see if the dog's son could fight. They wanted to test the bloodline. Pedro was not a naturally aggressive child. By all accounts, he was quiet, observant, and respectful. But he was cornered. He was forced to defend a reputation he hadn't earned yet. If he walked away from a fight, he was disgracing his father. If he fought and lost, he was a disappointment. If he fought and won, he was a bully. It was a no-win scenario that fostered a deep, simmering resentment and a need to prove himself that would never truly go away. He began to develop a shell. He learned to project a toughness he didn't always feel. He adopted the Perro persona, the snarl, the defiance, as a defense mechanism against the world that wouldn't let him just be Pedro. During these years, the relationship with his father was complex. Perro Sr. was often absent, touring Japan, the United States, and every corner of Mexico. When he was home, he was exhausted, a man physically shattered by the road. Pedro saw the ice packs. He saw the mornings when his father could barely walk down the stairs because his knees were locked up. Most fathers teach their sons to ride bikes. Perro Sr. taught Pedro that the body is a tool to be used up. He didn't explicitly push Pedro toward wrestling. In fact, like many wrestlers, he initially wanted a better life for his son, but the gravitational pull was too strong. The house was filled with trophies, masks won in apuestas matches, and the adoration of fans who would stop them in the street. Pedro didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer. He wanted to be the man the crowd roared for. He wanted to be the man who could take the pain and keep walking. The conversation that changed Pedro's life happened when he was barely a teenager. He approached his father and told him unequivocally that he wanted to train. He wanted to be a luchador. Perro Sr. was hesitant. He knew the cost. He knew the industry was a meat grinder that chewed up bodies and spit out cripples. He looked at his son, slender, smaller than him, with a frame that hadn't finished growing, and he saw vulnerability. But in the Aguayo household, desire was respected. They made a pact. If Pedro was to train, he would not be coddled. There would be no special treatment. In fact, it would be the opposite. He would have to suffer more than the others to prove he belonged. He would have to earn the name Perro. This was the moment Pedro signed away his childhood. While his friends were discovering video games and girls, Pedro was stepping into the Gimnasio del Diablo, the Devil's Gym. Lucha Libre training in the early 1990s was not the polished, safety-conscious curriculum of modern WWE performance centers. It was a dungeon. It was built on the ethos of Olympico, amateur Greco-Roman wrestling, and submission grappling. Pedro was handed over to the maestros, veteran wrestlers, who were tasked with breaking him. The instruction was simple: make him quit. If he stays, he's a wrestler. If he cries and leaves, he's just a rich kid. The sessions began at dawn. They started with hundreds of Hindu squats, sentadillas, a grueling exercise that burns the quadriceps and tears the ligaments if done without rhythm. Pedro, at 13 and 14 years old, was doing 500, then 1,000 reps. His legs would tremble uncontrollably. He would vomit from exertion. The maestros would scream at him, mocking his father's name, daring him to run home. Then came the puentes, bridges. This is the most critical and dangerous exercise for a wrestler. You arch your back, supporting your entire body weight on the soles of your feet and your forehead, creating a bridge. You hold it. Then you rock back and forth, nose to the mat, strengthening the neck muscles. For a developing teenager, this was agonizing. The cervical spine is forced into extreme hyperextension. The discs are compressed. Pedro would hold these bridges until his vision blurred, and the veins in his neck felt like they would burst. He was building the thick tree trunk neck required to absorb impact, but he was also grinding down the cartilage of his C-spine before he had even had a professional match. The headaches were constant. The stiffness was permanent. The art of falling. Then came the bumps. The art of falling is the art of survival. The ring is not a trampoline. It is a canvas-covered stage of plywood and steel beams. Pedro had to learn the flat back bump. You jump in the air, kick your legs out, and land flat on your back, tucking your chin to your chest to prevent your skull from cracking against the mat. Wham! Get up. Wham! Get up. He did this hundreds of times a day. His back was perpetually bruised, a canvas of purple and yellow. The shock waves traveled through his skeletal system, rattling his teeth and jarring his brain. At 14, his bones were still ossifying. The growth plates were open. Every bump was a micro-trauma. But the psychological training was even harder. He was the junior. The other trainees, hungry kids from the slums who saw wrestling as their only ticket out of poverty, hated him. They saw a prince playing at being a pauper. They stiffed him, hitting him harder than necessary, twisting his joints a little too far in submission holds. Pedro took it all. He never complained to his father. He never asked for mercy. He understood that his silence was his shield. By taking the beatings without a word, he was slowly, painfully earning their respect. He was forging a reputation for guts. By 1994, Pedro was no longer just a boy. He was a weapon in the making. He was still small, lighter and leaner than his father, but he was wiry and tough. He had developed a technical proficiency that surprised the veterans. He was fast. He combined the grounding of his father's style with the speed of the new generation. The industry was changing. AAA, Asistencia, Asesoría y Administración, had exploded onto the scene, revolutionizing Lucha Libre with lights, music, and American-style production. Perro Aguayo Jr. was a top star there. The promoters looked at Pedro and saw money. Perro Aguayo Jr. The name was printed on a poster before he was ready. He was 15 years old. The decision to debut him at 15 is one of the most controversial aspects of his early life. In the United States, this would be illegal. In Mexico, it was business. The logic was to capitalize on his father's fame, while Perro Sr. was still active. They wanted the image of father and son standing side by side. But physically, Pedro was a child. He was entering a world of grown men, many of whom were on steroids, painkillers, or simply naturally massive. He was entering a world where a mistake could mean paralysis. He was given his gear, the furry boots, the vest. It was a costume of his father. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see himself. He saw a miniature replica of the legend. He felt the crushing weight of the imposter syndrome. Was he good enough? Or was he just a marketing gimmick? The night of his professional debut was a blur of nausea and adrenaline. The venue was the Rio Nilo Coliseum in Tonalá, Jalisco. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the roar of thousands of fans. Backstage, the atmosphere was chaotic. Luchadores in masks were doing push-ups, oiling their bodies, praying to shrines of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Pedro sat in the corner, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His father walked over. Perro Sr. didn't give a long speech. He just checked Pedro's boots. He checked his wrist tape. He looked him in the eye and gave a nod. It was a transfer of power, a silent acknowledgement that the training was over and the war had begun. When the music hit and the announcer screamed, "El hijo del Perro Aguayo," the noise was deafening. Walking through the curtain for the first time is an out-of-body experience. The lights blind you. The heat of the crowd hits you like a physical wave. People were reaching out to touch him, screaming his father's name. Pedro climbed the turnbuckles. He looked out at the sea of faces. The match itself was a haze of instinct. He was in the ring with veterans who guided him, but they didn't go easy. He took his first professional chop to the chest, a stinging slap that feels like a whip. The crowd gasped. The prince could bleed. He moved fast. He hit the ropes, feeling the steel cable dig into his back. He executed a tijeras, head scissors, flying through the air. For a fleeting second, he felt weightless. He felt the magic. But then came the landing. The mat was harder than the gym. The air left his lungs. The match ended with his hand raised, standing next to his father. The crowd cheered, but Pedro knew the truth. They were cheering the image, not the man. As he walked to the back, adrenaline fading, the pain set in. His neck throbbed, his back ached. He sat on the bench in the locker room, sweat dripping off his nose, shaking from the adrenaline dump. He had survived. He was a professional wrestler. But as he unlaced his boots, looking at his bruised ankles, he realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't the end of the test. It was just the first day. He had to do this tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. He had stepped into the machine. He was 15 years old, and he had just sold his body to the business. The clock was running. The accumulation of damage that would one day snap a cable in Tijuana had officially begun. The period immediately following his 1995 debut was less a coronation and more a trial by exhaustion. Perro Aguayo Ramirez had survived his first match, but the adrenaline of that night quickly evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of the professional wrestling circuit. Between 1995 and roughly 2000, Pedro lived the life of a junior in the most punishing sense of the word. He was stuck in the lower to mid-card of AAA events, trapped in a paradox of visibility. He was famous enough that everyone knew his face, yet respected so little that he was often treated as a glorified prop. He spent these years crisscrossing the Mexican highways in cramped vans, sleeping in cheap motels where the air conditioning rattled like a dying engine. The glamour of the magazines was nowhere to be found. This was the Pueblo circuit, dusty fairgrounds, bull rings converted into wrestling venues, and municipal gyms that smelled of stale beer and liniment. It was here, away from the television cameras, that Pedro truly learned his trade. He learned how to listen to a crowd that didn't want to see him. He learned how to protect his body when a veteran opponent decided to reseat him, to hit him a little harder than necessary to teach him a lesson in humility. During this era, he was branded as a technico, a babyface / good guy. It was the default setting for the son of a legend. The promoter simply assumed that because the father was loved, the son would be too. They dressed him in bright colors. They had him high-five the children in the front row. They booked him in tag matches alongside his father, hoping the elder Aguayo's charisma would rub off on the younger via osmosis. But the chemistry was often awkward. Perro Sr. was a chaotic force of nature. Pedro was a leaner, faster, more technical athlete, but he lacked the raw, animalistic magnetism that made his father a god. Critics were harsh. The dedicated Lucha Libre press, often ruthless in their analysis, labeled him green, inexperienced, and heavily reliant on his surname. They pointed out his lack of bulk. They criticized his promos, which at the time felt rehearsed and lacking in conviction. He was trying to play the role of a noble hero, but his face, angular, sharp-eyed, with a natural sneer inherited from his father, told a different story. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a punk. As the late 90s bled into the early 2000s, Pedro began to find his footing through rivalry. A wrestler is often only as good as his opponent, and Pedro found his first great foil in a faction known as Los Vipers, led by the charismatic and chaotic Cybernetico. This rivalry was crucial for Pedro's development because it forced him to toughen up. The Vipers were a rough, brawling faction. To survive in the ring with them, Pedro had to abandon the polite, technical wrestling he had been taught and start fighting back. He began to incorporate more of his father's brawling style, the erratic stomps, the stiff forearms, the spear. He started using the lanza, a diving double foot stomp to the opponent's chest, as a signature maneuver. It was a move that required him to leap from the top rope, driving his entire body weight into his opponent. It looked devastating because it was devastating, both to the person taking it and to Pedro's own ankles and knees upon impact. But it got a reaction. It was the first sign that the dog was waking up. Despite these improvements, by 2002, Pedro felt stagnant. He had won the Mexican National Tag Team Championship with his father, and later the Mexican National Light Heavyweight Championship. But these titles felt like obligatory accessories rather than earned crowns. He was still Perro Aguayo Jr. He was still the copy. The shadow of his father was suffocating. Every time he walked into a room, he was introduced as the son of. He realized that as long as he stayed in AAA, the company where his father was a foundational pillar, he would never be the main attraction. He would always be the legacy act. In May 2003, Pedro made the decision that would define his career. In the tribal world of Mexican wrestling, there are two monolithic superpowers, AAA and CMLL, Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre. They are the Coca-Cola and Pepsi of Lucha Libre, and they do not mix. AAA was the modern televised spectacle. CMLL was the traditionalist stronghold, the oldest wrestling promotion in the world, based in the sacred arena Mexico, the cathedral of Lucha Libre. Perro Aguayo Ramirez defected. He left AAA, the home of his father, and jumped ship to CMLL. It was a shock to the system. It was seen by many as a betrayal of his roots, but for Pedro, it was a necessary severing of the umbilical cord. He needed to go to a place where his father's influence was less pervasive. He needed to step into the cathedral and see if he could survive on his own merits. The transition was brutal. The CMLL audience is notoriously difficult. They are purists. They value tradition and technical excellence above all else. When Pedro walked out onto the ramp at Arena Mexico for the first time, still trying to play the role of the smiling Técnico, the crowd ate him alive. They didn't see a hero. They saw an invader from the circus of AAA. They booed him mercilessly. They threw drinks. They chanted insults at his family. For months, Pedro tried to win them over. He wrestled great matches against technical wizards like Negro Casas and Shocker. He bumped like a maniac. He flew around the ring. But the boos only got louder. The harder he tried to be the good guy, the more they hated him. It was a pivotal moment of psychological reckoning. A lesser man might have crumbled or retreated back to the safety of AAA. Pedro, however, had an epiphany. He realized that the audience wasn't rejecting his wrestling. They were rejecting his disingenuousness. They could smell that he wasn't a hero. They hated him because he was a rich kid, an invader, a junior. So he decided to stop pretending. If they wanted a villain, he would give them the devil himself. The heel turn, the shift from good guy to bad guy, is a standard trope in wrestling. But what Perro Aguayo did in 2004 was not standard. It was a cultural shift. He didn't just become a rudo. He reinvented what a rudo could look like in the 21st century. He stopped shaving. He let his hair grow wild. He ditched the traditional colorful tights and started wearing baggy combat pants, oversized t-shirts, and street gear. He stopped high-fiving the kids and started spitting at the front row. He adopted a new, slower, more methodical walking pace. He stopped trying to impress the crowd with flips and started trying to hurt his opponents with closed fists and illegal chokes. But the most brilliant move was his recruitment policy. He looked around the CMLL locker room and found the other outcasts. He found Halloween and Damien 666, two wrestlers from Tijuana who were considered hardcore specialists, too violent and untraditional for the refined tastes of CMLL purists. He found Hector Garza, a charismatic superstar who had his own issues with authority. Together they formed Los Perros del Mal, the Dogs of Evil. This was not just a wrestling stable, it was a gang. In a landscape dominated by masked superheroes representing justice and order, Los Perros del Mal represented chaos, anarchy, and reality. They didn't care about the rules of Lucha Libre. They would rush the ring 5 at a time. They would beat down opponents with weapons. They would humiliate legends. Their catchphrase became a mantra for the disaffected youth of Mexico. Dios perdona, los perros no. God forgives, the dogs do not. Suddenly, something strange happened. The booing stopped. Or rather, it changed. The crowd started wearing the t-shirts. The Perros merchandise began to outsell everything else in the arena. Pedro had tapped into a vein of counterculture cool. He was the anti-hero that the new generation wanted. He was no longer Perro Aguayo Jr. He was simply El Perro. He was the alpha. Every great villain needs a great hero. And fate provided Pedro with the perfect adversary, Mystico. Mystico was the antithesis of everything Pedro stood for. He was a devout Catholic. He wore a gleaming white and gold mask. He was an aerial prodigy who moved like a video game character. And he was undeniably the biggest box office attraction Mexico had seen in decades. He was the silver and gold prince. Pedro Aguayo became his shadow. If Mystico was the sky, Pedro was the dirt. Their rivalry defined the mid-2000s boom period of Lucha Libre. It was a classic narrative, the saint versus the sinner. Pedro obsessed over destroying Mystico's mask. He would rip at it during matches, tearing the fabric, exposing the skin underneath, violating the sacred code of Lucha Libre. He would hit Mystico with low blows, illegal kicks to the groin, right in front of the referee, not caring if he got disqualified as long as he left Mystico lying in pain. The heat, the emotional reaction from the crowd was nuclear. People bought tickets just to see Mystico shut Pedro up or to see Pedro humble the Golden Boy. They sold out Arena Mexico week after week. It was during this feud that Pedro truly stepped out of his father's shadow. Perro Aguayo Sr. was a legend, yes, but he had never generated this kind of modern, electric rock star energy. Pedro had surpassed the father, not in titles, but in cultural relevance. The culmination of this era of dominance came in 2006, but not against Mystico. It was against another heavyweight legend, Universo 2000. This feud was deeply personal. Universo 2000 was the man who had effectively retired Pedro's father, delivering a tombstone piledriver, the Martillo Negro, to Perro Sr. in a match years prior. That move had caused severe neck injury to the father, a haunting foreshadowing of the son's future. Pedro sought vengeance. The match was set, Caballera contra Caballera, hair versus hair. In Mexico, for an unmasked wrestler, their hair is their honor. Losing it is a public shaming. The match was a bloodbath. It was a brawl that spilled out of the ring and into the stands. Pedro fought like a man possessed. He wasn't wrestling for a belt, he was wrestling for his family name. In the climax, after surviving illegal interference and weapon shots, Pedro utilized a low blow while the referee was distracted, the ultimate Perro's tactic to secure the pinfall. As he stood in the center of the ring, holding the clippers, watching Universo 2000's head being shaved bald, Perro Aguayo Ramirez looked out at the thousands of screaming fans. He was covered in sweat, his chest heaving, his own hair matted with blood. He wasn't the junior anymore. He was the King of Kings. He had avenged his father, he had conquered the cathedral, and he was the undisputed leader of the most powerful faction in the country. However, the cameras didn't see what happened when the adrenaline faded. By 2007 and 2008, the physical toll of his style was becoming impossible to ignore. Pedro was not a giant man. He was 5 feet 9 inches and roughly 185 pounds. Yet he was wrestling heavyweights who outweighed him by 50 or 60 pounds night after night. To make his offense look credible against these giants, he had to throw his body with reckless abandon. To make their offense look devastating, he had to take bumps that compressed his spine. The Lanza, his double stomp finisher, was destroying his ankles and knees. The whiplash from clotheslines and power bombs was grinding down the discs in his neck. He began to rely on painkillers to get through the tours. He wrapped his knees in layers of tape. He spent his days off in physiotherapy trying to unknot muscles that had turned to stone. But he couldn't stop. He was the engine of the company. If Los Perros del Mal weren't on the card, the ticket sales dropped. The responsibility of carrying the company, of feeding the other wrestlers in his faction, of maintaining the Perro brand, was a weight heavier than any opponent. He was winning the war, but he was slowly losing his body. And as 2008 approached, his ambition began to outgrow even the massive stage of CMLL. He was tired of answering to promoters. He was tired of having his creative vision stifled by traditionalists. He looked at the empire he had built with Los Perros del Mal and thought, why am I making money for someone else? By the winter of 2008, Perro Aguayo Ramirez had achieved everything a wrestler in Mexico is supposed to dream of. He was the undisputed top rudo villain of the Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre, CMLL. He was main eventing Friday nights at Arena Mexico, the cathedral of the sport. His merchandise was outselling the heroes he was booked to destroy. His faction, Los Perros del Mal, was the hottest act in the country. But Pedro was bored, and more dangerously, he was frustrated. To understand his mindset in 2008, one must understand the rigid, almost feudal structure of CMLL. It is a company steeped in tradition, run by a conservative programming department that views wrestling through a lens that hasn't changed much since the 1970s. In the CMLL ecosystem, the wrestler is labor. The promoter is the Lord. The wrestlers are expected to show up, perform their assigned roles, collect their pay envelopes, and go home. Creative input from the talent is discouraged. Ambition that exceeds the company's plans is viewed with suspicion. Pedro was not just a wrestler, he was a creative visionary. He saw the global landscape of professional wrestling changing. He watched WWE in the United States. He watched the rise of mixed martial arts. And he saw that the audience was evolving. The modern fan wanted nuance. They wanted shades of gray characters, not just white meat heroes and dastardly villains. They wanted storylines that blurred the lines between reality and fiction. Pedro pitched ideas to the CMLL booking committee. He wanted to expand Los Perros del Mal into a multimedia brand. He wanted to sell more aggressive merchandise. He wanted to change the lighting, the music, the presentation. He wanted to make Lucha Libre cool for the MTV generation. The answer was always a polite but firm no. The friction became unbearable. Pedro felt like a Ferrari engine stuck inside a Model T Ford. He realized that as long as he was an employee, he would never own his destiny. He was making millions of pesos for the company, but he had no ownership of the intellectual property he had created. If he left CMLL, the name Perros del Mal technically belonged to the promotion, or so they thought. He looked at his father's career for guidance. Perro Aguayo Jr. had been a mercenary, a man who worked for whoever paid the most, never tying himself down too long. But Pedro wanted more than that. He didn't want to just be a freelancer. He wanted to be the boss. In October 2008, Pedro Aguayo Ramirez dropped a nuclear bomb on the Mexican wrestling industry. He announced his departure from CMLL, but he didn't leave alone. In a move that displayed his immense influence and the loyalty he commanded from his peers, he took the core of his faction with him. Damian 666, Mr. Aguila, and Halloween, key players in the mid-card and main event scene, walked out with him. This was not just a resignation, it was a mutiny. They announced the formation of Perros del Mal Producciones. This was unprecedented. A top star leaving a major promotion in his prime to start his own promotion was a massive financial risk. The history of wrestling is littered with the corpses of wrestler-run companies that failed within 6 months. Without the television machinery of a major network like Televisa behind him, Pedro was effectively exiling himself to the wilderness. Critics called it suicide. They said Pedro was arrogant, that he overestimated his draw. They predicted he would be begging for his job back within a year. They were wrong. Pedro attacked the independent scene with the ferocity of a starving wolf. He wasn't just booking wrestling matches, he was booking happenings. He stripped away the pageantry of traditional lucha. No more mariachi bands, no more polite announcers. The Perros del Mal shows were gritty. They were held in nightclubs, in bull rings, in warehouses. The lighting was dim and smoky. The music was heavy metal and hip-hop. He tapped into a demographics that Lucha Libre had ignored, the disaffected urban youth. The kids who listened to Molotov and Control Machete. The kids who thought traditional wrestling was for their grandparents. Pedro proved to be a shrewd businessman. He negotiated his own sponsorship deals. He controlled the merchandise supply chain, ensuring that every t-shirt sold put money directly into the pockets of the boys, not a corporate office. He created a brotherhood. For 2 years, Perros del Mal Producciones was the coolest ticket in Mexico. Pedro was working harder than ever. He was the booker, the promoter, the accountant, and the main event. He was carrying the weight of an entire company on his back, literally and figuratively. But the physical cost of the independent hustle is severe. In the major companies, the rings are well maintained. There are doctors on standby. In the independent circuit, the rings are often stiff, made of old wood and loose springs. The travel is worse. Pedro was driving 10 hours a night, sleeping in the van, wrestling on concrete hard mats, and then driving to the next town. The accumulation of microfractures in his vertebrae accelerated during this period, 2008 to 2010. He was taking bad bumps, awkward landings on unyielding surfaces night after night to sell tickets. He was sacrificing his neck to build his brand. By 2010, the experiment had succeeded, but Pedro knew that to reach the next level, he needed television. He needed the mass exposure that only a major conglomerate could provide. On June 6, 2010, at Triple Mania 18, the Super Bowl of AAA, The impossible happened. AAA was in the middle of a main event match. The crowd was hot. Suddenly the lights flickered. A familiar, distorted guitar riff blasted through the stadium speakers. The screens lit up with the logo of a snarling dog. Thousands of people in the Palacio de los Deportes gasped in unison. Then the roar began. It started as a confused murmur and swelled into a deafening wall of sound. Perro Aguayo Ramirez walked out onto the stage. He was flanked by his lieutenants, Damian 666 Halloween, and the rest of the Perros. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was the enemy. He was the guy who had left for CMLL years ago. He was the independent rebel. He marched to the ring, grabbed a microphone, and declared war. He announced that Los Perros del Mal were not joining AAA. They were invading it. This was a masterstroke of business. Pedro had negotiated a deal that allowed him to return to the company where he started, but on his terms. He retained the rights to his brand. He kept his own faction. He was an independent contractor operating within the machine. The invasion storyline revitalized AAA. It gave the company a jagged, unpredictable edge. Pedro was instantly positioned as the top villain, the leader of a super faction called La Sociedad, the Society, which combined his Perros with other foreign heels and Conan's Legion. For the next 3 years, Perro Aguayo Jr. was the center of the AAA universe. He was the king of kings, Rey de Reyes, winning the prestigious tournament in 2012. He was the focal point of every major poster. He was the man everyone wanted to beat. But while his star power was at its zenith, his biology was beginning to fail. In April 2011, the invincible facade cracked. Pedro had been complaining of stomach pains for weeks. He dismissed it as the usual wrestler's diet. Too much caffeine, bad road food, stress. He took antacids and kept working. He wrestled through the pain because in his mind, stopping wasn't an option. The Perros brand relied on him. If he didn't wrestle, the storyline halted. Then he collapsed. He was rushed to a hospital in Guadalajara. The diagnosis was terrifying. A tumor in his stomach. For a few agonizing days, the word cancer hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The wrestling world held its breath. Was this the end of the dog? The surgery was invasive. Doctors had to cut through his abdominal wall to remove the mass. Fortunately, the biopsy came back benign. It wasn't cancer, but the complications were severe. The surgery revealed that his stomach was a mess of ulcers and internal trauma, likely caused by years of anti-inflammatory abuse. NSAIDs like ibuprofen and diclofenac are standard candy for wrestlers to manage pain, but they destroy the stomach lining. The doctors were clear. You need to rest, not for a few weeks, for months. You need to let your abdominal muscles knit back together. You cannot take bumps. You cannot be slammed. Perro Aguayo Ramirez lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. He was 31 years old. He had a scar running down his midsection. He had lost 30 pounds. He looked frail. Any rational person would have taken a year off, maybe retired. He had made his money. He had nothing left to prove. But Pedro was not operating on rational logic. He was operating on lucha logic. In Lucha Libre, if you are off TV for 6 months, you are forgotten. The spot you fought for is taken by a hungry kid. The merchandise sales dip. The heat evaporates. Furthermore, he felt a crushing responsibility to his pack. The guys in his faction relied on his position to get their bookings. If the leader was gone, the pack would starve. He returned to the ring in late May 2011, less than 2 months after major abdominal surgery. It was madness. The Perro Aguayo who returned in 2011 was different. He had to be. Because his core muscles, the abdominals, were compromised by the surgery, he couldn't take front bumps, landing flat on his stomach/face, comfortably. The impact felt like it would tear his incision open, so he adjusted his style. He began to take more bumps on his back and his neck. This is a crucial, often overlooked detail in the forensic analysis of his death. To protect his stomach, he overloaded his spine. When an opponent threw him, instead of landing flat and distributing the impact, he would rotate to land on his upper back and shoulders. This put significantly more torque on the cervical vertebrae, C1 to C7. He was protecting his gut by sacrificing his neck. He also changed his physique. Unable to do heavy compound lifting, squats, deadlifts, due to the surgery recovery, his muscle mass decreased. The thick trapezius muscles that protect the neck began to atrophy slightly. He was leaner, more jagged. Despite this, he wrestled a full schedule. He entered a violent feud with El Messias. He wrestled in cages. He wrestled in street fights. He was thrown through tables. Fans noticed he was looking tired. His eyes had dark circles that makeup couldn't hide. He moved a little slower, but his psychology was so good, his ability to manipulate the crowd with a look or a sneer, that he didn't need to be an athlete. He was an icon. The final great peak of his career came in the summer of 2013, the main event of Triple Mania 21. It was another Caballera contra Caballera, hair versus hair match. The opponent was Cybernetico, his old rival from the Viper days. The build-up was intense. It was billed as the battle for the soul of AAA, the leader of Los Perros versus the leader of La Secta. The match itself was a spectacle of brutality. It wasn't a technical masterpiece, it was a brawl. Pedro bled buckets. He was thrown into the steel guardrails. He took a choke slam from Cybernetico, a move where he is lifted by the throat and slammed onto his back. Watch the footage of that match closely. When Pedro lands from the choke slam, he grimaces, not in the performative way a wrestler sells a move, but with a sharp, wincing reflex. He grabs his neck. He rolls his head to check for sensation in his fingers. He won the match. Cybernetico was shaved bald. Pedro stood on the turnbuckle, holding a clump of his enemy's hair, screaming in triumph. The pyrotechnics exploded behind him. He looked like a god of war, but backstage the reality was grim. He was icing his neck constantly. He was complaining of numbness in his arms, a classic symptom of cervical radiculopathy, pinched nerves in the neck. His spine was sending him SOS signals. Stop. Please stop. But 2014 was coming. Rey Mysterio was rumored to be leaving WWE. The dream match, the one that would make the most money in history, was on the horizon. Pedro couldn't stop now. He was on the 1-yard line. He pushed the pain down. He swallowed the pills. He taped his neck. And he kept booking dates. The stage was being set for Tijuana. The gun was loaded. It just hadn't been fired yet. By 2014, the landscape of Mexican professional wrestling had stabilized into a predictable rhythm, with Perro Aguayo Jr. standing firmly at the center of the industry's vortex. He had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from rebellious independent promoter back to mainstream superstar. His faction, Los Perros del Mal, was no longer just a stable. It was the primary antagonist force driving ticket sales for AAA. However, beneath the surface of sold-out arenas and record-breaking merchandise numbers, a quiet stagnation was setting in. Perro had beaten everyone. He had shaved the heads of legends, retired veterans, and humiliated young upstarts. He needed a new challenge, not just for his bank account, but to reignite the creative fire that had driven him since his defection from CMLL. The industry was buzzing with a singular rumor that overshadowed every other storyline: the potential return of Rey Mysterio Jr. The King of Mystery had been the face of WWE's cruiserweight division for over a decade, becoming a global icon far surpassing the fame of any domestic luchador. But by 2014, Mysterio's relationship with the American Giant was fracturing. His knees were shot, his contract was expiring, and he was openly flirting with the idea of returning to his roots in Mexico. For Perro, this was the end game. A feud with Mysterio wasn't just another program. It was the only money match left that could top what he had already achieved. It was the collision of the two greatest luchadors of their generation, the ultimate rudo against the ultimate technico. While the lawyers argued over contracts in Stamford, Connecticut, Perro kept grinding in Mexico City. The schedule in 2014 was relentless. AAA was touring aggressively to capitalize on their 22nd anniversary, and as the top draw, Perro was required on almost every major card. The physical toll of this period cannot be overstated. Unlike the American schedule, which often allows for TV days involving less physical contact, the lucha style demands high-impact sequences in every appearance. Perro was 34 years old, an age where most technical wrestlers enter their prime, but his body had the mileage of a 50-year-old. The cervical spine issues that had begun as nagging stingers were now chronic. He was managing pain through a regimen of massage therapy, anti-inflammatories, and sheer willpower, often seen stretching his neck compulsively backstage to relieve the pressure on his nerve roots. Parallel to the drama in the major leagues, a new phenomenon was rising in the border city of Tijuana: the Crash Lucha Libre. Tijuana has always been a unique ecosystem in wrestling history. Located just across the border from San Diego, it is a hybrid zone where the American hard-hitting style blends with the aerial insanity of traditional lucha. The crowds in Tijuana are notoriously difficult. They are working-class, rowdy, and bloodthirsty. They do not cheer for polite wrestling. They want violence, and they want reality. The Crash, a promotion founded in 2011, had begun to capture this market by booking super indie dream matches that the big companies like AAA and CMLL were too bureaucratic to put together. They operated out of the Auditorio Fausto Gutierrez, a venue that is legendary for its intense atmosphere and unforgiving acoustics. For Perro, Tijuana was a second home. It was the birthplace of his closest allies, Damian 666 and Halloween. It was where Los Perros del Mal had recruited their most loyal soldiers. The chaotic energy of the border suited Perro's anti-establishment persona perfectly. He was the uncrowned king of Tijuana, and the local fans treated him with a reverence that bordered on religious fanaticism. In February 2015, the domino finally fell. WWE announced the departure of Rey Mysterio. Almost immediately, the Mexican independent circuit went into a frenzy. Promoters across the country scrambled to secure the first dates for the returning hero, while AAA secured the rights for his major television return at the Rey de Reyes pay-per-view. The agile promoters at the Crash managed to book him for a massive homecoming show in Tijuana, scheduled for March 20th, 2015. The booking was simple, yet perfect. It would be a tag team match. On one side, the returning idol Rey Mysterio would team with the Extreme Tiger, a local Tijuana hero known for his suicidal high-flying moves. On the other side, the welcoming committee from hell, Perro Aguayo Jr., and Manique, an American technical wrestler known as TJ Perkins. This match was designed to be a showcase. It was not a blood feud that needed to be settled. It was a celebration of Lucha Libre excellence. The logic of the booking was sound. By making it a tag team match, the promoters could hide the physical limitations of both Rey Mysterio, whose knees were fragile, and Perro Aguayo, whose neck and back were deteriorating. The two legends could interact in short, explosive bursts, letting the younger, healthier partners, Manik and Extreme Tiger, do the heavy lifting and take the dangerous bumps. It was a standard industry practice to protect the top stars, while still delivering the dream match moments the crowd paid to see. The day of the event began like hundreds of others in Perro's career. He flew into Tijuana, a city buzzing with anticipation. The Auditorio Fausto Gutierrez was sold out hours before the doors opened. The atmosphere outside the arena was electric, with vendors selling unauthorized merchandise featuring Perro's snarling dog logo next to Mysterio's mask. Inside the locker room, the mood was light. Perro was reportedly in good spirits, joking with Konnan, who was there as a manager and creative mind. Konnan was the bridge between all these men. He had mentored Rey, he was a father figure to Perro, and he had booked Manik. It was a family reunion disguised as a prize fight. Physically, Perro was hurting, but no more than usual. The usual for a 20-year veteran, however, involves a baseline of pain that would hospitalize a normal person. His neck was stiff. He spent time warming up carefully, trying to get the blood flowing to his trapezius muscles. There were no ominous signs, no premonitions of doom. It was just another Friday night at the office. The plan for the match was straightforward. Heat up the crowd, let Extreme Tiger fly around, have a few intense exchanges with Rey to tease the future singles match, and go home. When the music hit for the main event, the noise in the auditorio was deafening. Los Perros del Mal had always commanded a reaction, but tonight was different. The crowd was split down the middle. Half were there to worship the returning son, Rey Mysterio. The other half were there to see Perro spoil the party. Perro walked through the curtain with his signature swagger, chin up, eyes scanning the crowd with disdain, the championship belt slung arrogantly over his shoulder. He looked every bit the superstar he was. He was wearing his black t-shirt and wrestling tights, his wrists taped heavily. He climbed into the ring and did his standard routine, posing on the turnbuckle, soaking in the jeers and the cheers. He looked healthy. He looked strong. When Rey Mysterio made his entrance, the building shook. The two men stood across the ring from each other, and the tension was palpable. This was the moment the business had waited years for. The bell rang. The match started with a fast pace. Extreme Tiger and Manik opened the bout, exchanging rapid-fire technical holds and high-speed evasions. It was classic lucha-style, fluid, acrobatic, and choreographed to look like a violent dance. The crowd popped for every move, but they were waiting for the tag. They wanted the captains. When Perro finally tagged in to face Rey Mysterio, the energy shifted. They circled each other. They locked up. The interactions were sharp. Perro used his size advantage to bully the smaller Mysterio, throwing stiff kicks and punches. Mysterio responded with his trademark speed, using leverage to toss Perro across the ring. Everything was going according to plan. Perro was taking bumps, falling to the mat safely and professionally. He took a head scissors takedown from Mysterio, flipping over and landing on his back. He rolled out of the ring to regroup, playing to the crowd, stalling for time to let the anticipation build. He rolled back in. He took a kick to the ribs. He fed into the momentum of the match, guiding the younger guys, calling spots, being the ring general he was known to be. Approaching the 6-minute mark, the match moved into its second act. The pace quickened. It was time to set up the finish sequence. Perro was in the center of the ring. He took a drop kick from Mysterio. He staggered. He was positioned to take the next move, a setup for the 619, Mysterio's famous finishing maneuver that requires the opponent to fall onto the middle rope. Perro accepted the impact. He threw his weight forward to sell the move. However, the geometry of the fall was imperfect. Instead of his chest landing flush against the cables to absorb the momentum, his body trajectory was slightly lower and more uncontrolled than usual. The ropes in a Lucha Libre ring are not soft. They are steel cables encased in a thin layer of garden hose or rubber tubing, pulled to a high tension to allow for the high-flying acrobatics the style is famous for. Hitting them is like hitting a rigid, unpredictable bar. As Perro fell forward, his knees buckled. His neck, already compromised by years of trauma, struck the edge of the middle rope. The point of contact was not the chest or the shoulder, but the trachea and the cervical spine. The steel cable did not give. It acted as a fulcrum. In that split second, the laws of physics enacted a catastrophic toll on Perro Aguayo's body. The sudden deceleration caused a violent whiplash effect. His head snapped backward and then forward with extreme velocity. Inside the spinal column, the C1, atlas, C2, axis, and C3 vertebrae, the delicate bones at the very top of the neck that support the skull, suffered a catastrophic failure. The sheer force of the snap caused a fracture in 3 places, but the bone break was only the beginning of the physiological collapse. The jagged movement of the vertebrae likely sheared or dissected the vertebral artery or caused immediate severe trauma to the spinal cord itself. The spinal cord at the C1 to C2 level controls the autonomic functions of the body, breathing and heart rate. The connection was severed instantly. The brain stopped sending signals to the heart. Perro suffered a cardiac arrest immediately upon impact. He slumped onto the bottom rope. His arms went limp. He did not reach for his neck. He did not writhe in pain. He simply turned off. For the thousands of fans in the Auditorio Fausto Gutierrez and even for the wrestlers in the ring, the severity of the moment was completely invisible. Professional wrestling relies on the suspension of disbelief. Wrestlers are experts at pantomime. They are trained to act hurt when they are fine, and to act fine when they are hurt. When Perro slumped onto the ropes, it looked like a cell. It looked like a villain playing possum, waiting for the hero to make a mistake so he could launch a counterattack. Rey Mysterio, seeing Perro on the ropes, continued the sequence. He ran to the opposite side of the ring, rebounded, and swung through the ropes to deliver the 619. This is the most haunting image of the night. As Rey swung his legs through the ropes, Perro was slumped so low that Rey's boots passed harmlessly over his head. Rey, a consummate professional, realized mid-air that the spacing was wrong. He didn't make contact. He landed, turned, and looked at Perro. In the wrestling mind, a missed spot is just an error. You improvise. You move on. Nobody screams, "Cut." The match continued around the dying man. This is the part that generated the most controversy, but it is also the most understandable when viewed through the lens of industry conditioning. The other wrestler, Manic T.J. Perkins, saw that Perro was out of position. He didn't know why. He assumed Perro was perhaps gassed, winded, or just selling the drop kick for a long time to build tension. Manic stepped up to take the heat. He engaged with Rey Mysterio, keeping the action flowing so the crowd wouldn't get bored. They ran a sequence of reversals. Meanwhile, at ringside, the first crack in the illusion appeared. Conan, the veteran manager, was standing just a few feet away from Perro's face. He was playing his character yelling instructions, but Perro wasn't responding. Conan leaned in. He said something. No response. Conan then began to shake Perro. He grabbed him by the shoulders and jostled him roughly. From a medical perspective, this was the worst possible action. In a suspected cervical spine injury, mobilization is strictly forbidden. The neck must be immobilized immediately. Shaking a patient with a C1 to C2 fracture can exacerbate the spinal cord trauma, turning a severe injury into a fatal one. But Conan was not thinking like a paramedic. He was thinking like a wrestler. Wake up. We are live. The match is ending. You need to move. He shook him again. Pedro! Pedro! Perro's head bobbed loosely like a doll's. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring into the middle distance. While Monique and Rey Mysterio continued to wrestle less than 6 feet away, Perro's body was shutting down. Without a heartbeat, oxygen was no longer reaching his brain. A minute passed. The referee, Rick Knox, a veteran official who had refereed thousands of matches, began to notice the anomaly. He leaned over Perro. He asked him if he was okay. There was no verbal response. Knox tapped his shoulder. Nothing. Knox then made a critical error in judgment, born of the chaos of the moment. He didn't stop the match immediately. He assumed, like everyone else, that Perro was just stunned. He turned his attention back to the active wrestlers, Rey and Monique, who were setting up the finish. At this point, fans in the front row began to notice something was wrong. They saw Perro's skin color changing. The vibrant, sweaty tan was draining away, replaced by a pallid, waxen gray. Conan was now frantic. He was yelling at the referee, "Check him! Check him!" The surreal nature of the scene cannot be overstated. The crowd was cheering for Rey Mysterio, who was hitting his finishing splash on Monique. The referee counted 1, 2, 3. The bell rang. The music hit. Rey Mysterio celebrated his victory. But in the corner, a tragedy was unfolding in plain sight. As soon as the 3 count was registered, the facade broke completely. Rey Mysterio didn't celebrate for long. He went straight to Perro. He leaned down and spoke to him. He saw the eyes. The gloss was gone. The pupils were fixed. Rey signaled to the back. He made the X sign with his arms, the universal wrestling code for a legitimate injury. But the production team, perhaps thinking it was part of the show or just slow to react, didn't cut the music immediately. The festive, high-energy victory theme played over the scene of a man entering the final stages of biological death. It took nearly 2 minutes from the moment of impact for the first medical attention to arrive. And when it did, it was woefully inadequate. The ringside physician, Dr. Ernesto Franco, was reportedly attending to another wrestler backstage. The emergency team that approached Perro consisted of local commission doctors and handlers who appeared unprepared for a trauma of this magnitude. They tried to talk to him. They tried to lift him. Perro's body was heavy, dead weight. When they lifted his arms, they fell instantly. There was no muscle tone. The scene descended into a disorganized panic. Wrestlers from the back came out. Damien 666, Perro's best friend, ran to the ring. He saw Conan's face and knew it was bad. There was no cervical collar immediately available. There was no backboard ready at ringside. There was no oxygen tank within reach. The audience, initially confused, began to go quiet. The cheering stopped. A murmur rippled through the auditorio. They saw the frantic hand gestures. They saw the fear in Rey Mysterio's eyes, visible even through his mask. They saw the way Perro's head lolled to the side, completely unsupported, as the handlers tried to figure out how to move him. The definitive image of the tragedy, the one that would spark outrage across the world and change legislation, occurred next. Needing to get Perro out of the ring and to an ambulance, the staff realized they did not have a stretcher. The stretcher that was supposed to be there had been used to transport a previous wrestler, and it hadn't been returned or replaced. In a moment of desperate improvisation, someone grabbed a piece of plywood, a flat, rigid board used for advertising or ring maintenance. They slid Perro Aguayo Jr., a man with a snapped neck and a stopped heart, onto a piece of raw lumber. They didn't strap him down. They didn't immobilize his head. 4 men grabbed the corners of the plywood and lifted him. As they carried him through the ropes, his body jostled. His head bounced. The crowd parted, some screaming, some taking photos with their phones. The flash bulbs popped, illuminating the gray face of the fallen idol. He was carried out of the arena through the tunnel past the popcorn vendors and the merchandise stands. The Prince of Lucha Libre, the leader of the Dogs of Evil, was exiting the stage not in glory, but on a plank of wood amidst a cloud of confusion and incompetence. Inside the ring, a pool of urine stained the canvas where he had lain, a final undignified biological marker of the body releasing its functions. The show was over. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise the arena had ever produced. The concept of the golden hour in trauma medicine dictates that a patient's chances of survival are highest if they receive definitive care within the first 60 minutes of an injury. But for Perro Aguayo Ramirez, that critical window had been shattered before he even left the arena. As he was carried through the claustrophobic tunnels of the Auditorio Fausto Gutierrez on a sheet of raw plywood, the physiological damage was compounding with every jostle and stumble of his handlers. The absence of a cervical collar meant that his head, now effectively disconnected from the stability of the spinal column due to the fractures at the C1, C2, and C3 levels, was bobbing with the movement of the crowd. This uncontrolled motion likely exacerbated the spinal cord compression, turning what might have been a catastrophic injury into an irreversible one before he ever reached the sterile safety of a hospital. The scene outside the arena was equally chaotic, a cacophony of confused fans and shouting staff that delayed the transfer to the ambulance, further squandering the precious seconds that remained. When the ambulance finally screeched away from the venue, the situation inside was desperate. Conan, still wearing his wrestling gear, had forced his way into the vehicle, screaming at the paramedics to save his friend. But the medical response was hamstrung by a lack of advanced equipment. Reports later indicated that the transport unit was not a mobile, intensive care unit capable of handling such severe neurotrauma. It was a basic transport vehicle lacking the necessary intubation tools to manage a patient in full respiratory arrest. By the time the doors closed, Pedro had been without oxygenated blood flow to his brain for several minutes. His pupils fixed and dilated, his skin turning a cyanotic blue-gray that signaled the profound failure of his cardiopulmonary system. He was, for all intents and purposes, a corpse being transported through the neon-lit streets of Tijuana, leaving behind a ring that was still stained with the fluids of his collapse. The ambulance arrived at the Hospital del Prado at approximately 1:10 a.m., screaming into the emergency bay where a trauma team was waiting. They transferred him from the gurney to a trauma bed, but the initial assessment was grim. There was no palpable pulse, no spontaneous respiration, and his Glasgow Coma Scale score was a 3, the lowest possible rating indicating deep coma or death. Dr. Ernesto Franco, the designated physician for the Boxing and Wrestling Commission, who had followed the ambulance, coordinated the resuscitation effort. They intubated him immediately, forcing air into his lungs, and began aggressive CPR, compressing the chest that had just minutes ago been taking wrestling bumps. They pushed epinephrine and atropine into his veins in a desperate attempt to jumpstart the heart, hoping for a miracle that biology simply could not provide. While the doctors fought a losing battle behind the closed doors of the trauma room, the hospital hallway began to fill with the surreal cast of the tragedy. It was a scene that looked like a carnival had crashed into a funeral. Wrestlers who had been performing just an hour ago were pacing the sterile white corridors, still wearing parts of their colorful costumes and masks. Rey Mysterio arrived, still masked, his eyes wide with shock and confusion, joined by Manik, Extreme Tiger, and other luchadors from the undercard who huddled together in hushed groups. The bravado of the locker room had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying vulnerability of men who realized their invincibility was a lie. Conan paced relentlessly, making frantic phone calls to Pedro's family in Guadalajara, trying to find the words to explain the unexplainable to a mother who had watched her son leave home healthy and strong. The atmosphere was heavy with denial, as these men conditioned to believe in the work and the show waited for the doctor to come out and say it was just a severe concussion or a stinger, anything other than the silence that was currently emanating from the trauma bay. At roughly 1:30 a.m. on March 21st, 2015, the door to the trauma room opened, and Dr. Franco emerged with a heaviness that silenced the hallway. He did not need to speak for the group to understand the outcome. The resuscitation efforts had ceased because there was no brain activity to salvage. Perro Aguayo Ramirez was officially pronounced dead at the age of 35. The cause of death listed as cardiac arrest due to cervical stroke caused by 3 fractured vertebrae. In layman's terms, his neck had snapped upon impact with the ropes, cutting off the signal to his heart and killing him almost instantly in the ring. The hour at the hospital had merely been a formality of medical protocol. The reaction in the hallway was visceral, as grown men known for their stoicism broke down in tears, and Rey Mysterio slumped against the wall, crushed by a guilt that, while legally and logically misplaced, was emotionally inescapable for the man who had delivered the final blow. As the sun began to rise over Tijuana, the news broke the containment of the hospital walls and flooded the digital world. In 2015, social media was the primary nervous system of the wrestling industry, and the first tentative tweets quickly turned into definitive reports from trusted Lucha Libre journalists. The headline, "Perro Aguayo Jr. D's in Ring," trended worldwide, picked up by major outlets like CNN, the BBC, and ESPN. However, the mainstream coverage often lacked nuance, running sensational headlines that implied Rey Mysterio had killed an opponent, sparking a wave of misdirected outrage from casual observers who did not understand the collaborative nature of professional wrestling. For the wrestling community, the morning of March 21st was a collective trauma, as fans woke up to videos of the death circulating on YouTube and Vine, analyzing the footage frame by frame. They watched the limp body, the shaking by Conan, and the horrific plywood board transfer, and their grief quickly turned into a blinding anger at the sheer shabbiness and negligence of the medical response. By noon on Saturday, the Baja California State Attorney General's office announced they were opening an investigation into the death, treating it as a priority case due to the high profile of the victim and the viral video evidence. The authorities seized the tapes, interviewed the referee Rick Knox, and inevitably requested to question Rey Mysterio. For a terrifying 48 hours, there was a legitimate fear within the industry that Mysterio could be charged with manslaughter, though the legal defense remained that it was a sporting accident inherent to the risks of the profession. However, the investigation quickly pivoted away from the wrestlers and toward the promotion and the medical staff, asking uncomfortable questions about why it took so long for help to arrive, where the spinal board was, and why the patient was moved without stabilization. Back in Guadalajara, the news reached the Aguayo family compound, shattering the world of Perro Aguayo Sr., the legend whose shadow Pedro had chased his entire life. The father, now retired and in poor health, was devastated by the Shakespearean tragedy of outliving the son he had trained. The dog had lost his pup, and the silence from the Aguayo estate was deafening as they requested privacy to prepare for a funeral that would bring the city to a standstill. That weekend, wrestling shows across Mexico transformed into somber tributes, with 10-bell salutes ringing out in arenas from Mexico City to Monterrey. Every wrestler who stepped into a ring that Saturday night looked at the ropes differently, realizing that the line between being a superstar and a statistic was razor thin, dependent entirely on the angle of a fall and the competence of the person holding the stretcher. Perro Aguayo Ramirez now rests in Guadalajara, far away from the plywood boards and the screaming fans. The shows continue, the bumps are still taken, and the lights still shine, but the ring is a little emptier, a little colder. The prince is dead, but the howl of the dog echoes forever in the halls of Lucha Libre.